All right, so for the sake of time, I'm just going to jump in and get started. Welcome again. Hello, thanks for being here. My name is Sarah McGrew, and I have the privilege of moderating this panel on media literacy in an era of truth decay. I'm a faculty member in the College of Education at University of Maryland. I'm also a former high school social studies teacher. And my work now is focused on how schools and teachers can support young people to effectively learn to evaluate online information on civic issues. That's work that I began as a PhD student with the Stanford History Education Group, and that I'm continuing now at Maryland. And I'm lucky to be joined by four really amazing panelists who I will introduce in a moment. But first, I want to take just a couple of minutes to frame the issues that we're going to be talking about this evening and to offer a couple of definitions. So first, all of this work sort of proceeds from the presumption that democracy depends on a knowledgeable citizenry that can use relevant information to inform their political choices. And helping students build knowledge of our country's history and its democratic system has long been a goal of civic education in the US, right? But I would argue that teaching students the skills they need to effectively find and evaluate information they'll use to inform their civic decisions and actions is just as critical. So building both the knowledge and skills to find information in the future. And teaching media literacy does just that. It focuses on supporting students to access, evaluate, analyze, and create media. And while media literacy focuses on all forms of media, right, including print, TV, radio, young people are increasingly reliant, and really all of us are increasingly relying on the internet for news and information. And that, of course, brings new opportunities, but also some real challenges. The internet has exponentially increased our access to information and increased opportunities to share our perspectives with a wide audience. And those things are great. But we're also, I think, all too familiar with the downsides of the internet. In an environment where so much information spreads with relative freedom, it can be really difficult to decide what to trust. It can be tempting to just find information that matches what we already believe. And it can be really easy to fall prey to mis and disinformation. Truth decay is a term that researchers from the RAND Corporation have used to describe this increasingly kind of blurry line between fact and fiction in American public life. And those researchers have documented an increasing disagreement about objective facts that exists on a scale that really hasn't been observed in previous periods. There's a lot of possible explanations for truth decay, and figuring that out really isn't our mission tonight. But what I hope we can agree on is first that truth decay is dangerous for our democracy, right? Secretary King in the talk that opened said, you know, our democracy is really fragile and things like truth decay can really threaten it. And second, that teaching media literacy is one way to counter truth decay, one really powerful way. So over the course of the next hour, we're going to ask how people across our state are already engaging in media literacy efforts, the students, teachers, librarians, and community organizations leading these efforts to create content, to share their perspectives with others, and then to learn to effectively find and evaluate information on topics that matter to them. And we'll consider the additional resources that help us ensure more equitable access across the state. And media literacy, I just want to point out before we start, is something that can and should be taught across the curriculum. I was a social studies teacher, but this isn't just a social studies thing. And it should be taught both in and out of school contexts. And I'm really excited and lucky to be joined by four experts from across the state who I think represent that range of ways that media literacy can engage young people. So I want to take a second to introduce the panelists and then we'll jump right in. So Annika Seth is a senior at Montgomery Blair High School in Silver Spring and one of the current editors-in-chief of Blair's student newspaper, Silver Chips. Outside of journalism, she's actively involved in competitive robotics, public forum debate, and is currently working on climate change research at Johns Hopkins. Destiny Brown is a filmmaker, actress, and teacher, born and raised in Baltimore. She's a youth producer for Wide Angle Youth Media, an organization that works with youth from across Baltimore City to produce digital media projects about their lives and communities. Destiny is currently a college sophomore at NYU, where she studies acting and psychology. Jennifer Sturge is employed by Calvert County Public Schools She's been an educator for 27 years, is a longtime proponent of both school and public libraries, and currently serves as the Maryland Association of School Librarians president. And finally, Scott Berman is a social studies content specialist for Washington County Public Schools, and previously he served as an assistant principal and a classroom teacher. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight. And just before we dive in, I think it's been said in the chat, but please do put any comments or questions in the chat, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end to dive into those together as a panel. But I want to start off, and I'm going to talking about sort of bright spots in media literacy in our state. And I'd love to start with Annika and Destiny and hear from you about ways you've seen young people in Maryland producing, sharing, and evaluating media.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like you were saying earlier, thank you for the introduction. As like the editor-in-chief of Blair's student newspaper, I've seen a lot of students really come into their own political socialization by writing about and researching really pressing topics. I mean, living so close to DC, especially in Montgomery County, we have so many student leaders in the climate change movement trying to counter the climate crisis. We have so many leaders advocating for gun control and police brutality and stopping that, and the Black Lives Matter protests as well. And I think when students kind of see their peers being showcased in that light and kind of see content that's produced by their peers, about their peers, and for their peers, that kind of makes all these political topics feel so much more real and pervasive and important to our daily lives. And I think that in turn kind of has this positive feedback effect of having students want to then be involved in their own regard. And we kind of see this greater influx of people wanting to be involved and learn more, and then be involved in what they've learned more about. And that's very unique to student journalism and student content, because, from personal experience, when I was younger, I was probably, the least political person, as far away from that as you can get, because I didn't see the importance of being politically active, because I didn't think things mattered to me personally. But as I learned more, as I got more involved, I saw the impact that, grassroots organization can have. And that's largely because of other student leaders that I looked up to when I was in middle and early high school. And I think as a high school leader now, that's a role that I want to take on to empower more young students. I think that that's a role that a lot of students can take on through producing media content.
Yeah, just to add on to that, at White Angle, one of the pillars of our curriculum is media literacy, because it's so important to be able to dissect the media that we consume every day in order to understand when you're thinking for yourself and when someone else is thinking for you. And so one of the current classes that I taught, Capture, Create, and Conquer, students analyzed advertisements from the past and compare them to present advertisements to see how some stereotypical messages that we had all the way back in the 50s still rear their heads nowadays, just in different forms. And to be able to analyze an advertisement and separate the image from the text was really empowering for students, and just taught them to look at newspapers differently, to look at more than one source when they're looking at information about an article, to always question everything and never take anything for granted. And for our students, we turned it into a project that became about themselves. So I titled it the This Is Me project, and using those same concepts of media literacy, they had to create an autobiographical image and tie a caption to it that, using these concepts of media literacy, sent off a message that they wanted the world to know. And so it was a really empowering moment for these students to understand that. And for students like Annika, it's I'm still a student at NYU, but it's like I'm able to see the next generation of leaders, and to empower them with these skills to understand what they're intaking is just one of the first steps to that leadership.
Yeah. I really appreciate that both of you brought up that the concept of empowerment, right? And like how empowering it can be to learn to critique and produce, and how we can like build on all the incredible things young people are already doing, and support them to be even more empowered. So Jennifer and Scott, I'd love you to talk a little bit about your own efforts or efforts you've seen to embed media literacy in schools, thinking about Annika and Destiny are bringing these perspectives from extracurricular and out of school experiences. What can this look like in school settings?
So Scott actually messaged me and invited me to go first. So I'll just jump right in. From the perspective of the library, one of the things that we have worked really hard at in our district is to create curriculum that really addresses media literacy and information literacy. And last year with our social studies educators, we piloted the News Literacy Project in grades 6 through 12 to really hone in on things that they were seeing, to really talk about the First Amendment, how to analyze newspaper articles, images, what they're seeing on social media. And I think one of the things that I think that we're doing really well in school libraries is we actually start this in kindergarten. And we use PBS and Arthur, and they have a whole series of media literacy lessons that we start in K and we move through grade 2 with them. And so by the time we're in second grade, we're really looking at how do you dissect a picture? How do you know if something is real or fake when you're looking at it on the internet? And ways in which advertisements can affect you. And I mean, these kids are 7, and it's amazing how excited and into it they are, and the opinions that they just bring into the library as they go along. Oh, I see somebody put something in the chat about Arthur as well. So he must be well known. So those are just some of the steps that we're taking, and those are definitely some of the bright spots that we're seeing. We've also partnered with the museum a few times to do some media literacy professional development with the librarians, which has gone over beautifully. So, and brought that to our social studies educators as well.
Sorry, I'm learning how to unmute myself before I talk. So, so I am a high school content specialist. So typically I deal with a domain of social studies instruction at the high school level. And within the state of Maryland, there's a couple of good things that are hovering around tangentially that bring attention to civics. And that's the fact that we have a high school assessment. We do have competitions like We the People in our county that helps bring attention to civic understanding. And we also have skill standards in the state of Maryland. So all of these things kind of hover around this notion of being able to separate truth from fiction. But my work and my attempt has been recently to bring an understanding of what is truth and a clearer focus. And largely that's been through using civic online reasoning, which Dr. McGrew is well aware of. In fact, it was her presentation that really brought me that resource. But also the News Literacy Project, with jives really well with civic online reasoning. I've been looking into the RAND publication. They put out a paper about truth decay, and they have some media literacy standards that are pretty clear and easy to follow, and they're relatively brief. So it's one of those things where we have a good start, but unfortunately so much has been done to erode people's concept of what truth is and how to work on that effectively in a classroom, that we have some catching up to do. And that's really where I spend a lot of my time and effort and energy thinking about how to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's always important for me to remember that this is part of the solution, right? That like media literacy comes with its own challenges and absolutely can't fix this whole problem of truth decay. So I really appreciate that point, Scott. And I'm curious, for many of the panelists thinking about, we've heard a little bit about bright spots, but what are the challenges that exist when we start to address media literacy efforts with young people? And I'm going to leave that question kind of broad on purpose because I'd love to hear what all of you think about the biggest challenges that you encounter in doing this work.
All right, I don't mind starting this one then.
Oh, good.
I think a really big challenge that is recognizing that something that is factually correct might not be contextually correct. So for example, last month reporting on the terror attack at the Capitol, I think it's a really big disservice to not highlight the stark contrast in police response to that attack versus BLM protests this summer. So while yes, you can report just the facts from January 6th without the context of the BLM protests this summer, that is not a contextually correct nor media literate way to approach that subject. And I think it's a really big challenge to learn, how do we balance all the competing and all the conflicting narratives in different news sources? Sure, you have one source that says one thing. Do you have a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth? Can you really corroborate all of your facts? How do you really portray every single facet of this issue in the most anti-racist and anti-bigoted way possible without losing sight of that one news event, right? And I think that's a really big challenge, especially as students navigating like that world on our own, kind of learning about all these issues for the first time as we kind of grow up in this very turbulent society and world and global community. How do we really make sure that we are always adopting this actively anti-racist lens in our reporting is a really big challenge for me personally.
I can hop in with some of the challenges that we see from a school perspective. One of them is the curriculum is so packed that it is really difficult sometimes to find time to get teachers to buy into the collaboration with the school librarians to do the important work. But the outcome is so amazing when it does happen, particularly one of the things that you were just talking about, how do you look at all sides of an issue? And that's a skill set that school librarians, were trained for. We teach the lateral searching skills and how to sift through that information. And so if we can overcome the challenge of finding the time to do that collaboration, it's something that can be done and can be done really, really well. Another challenge that I've been thinking about a lot after the events at the Capitol, one of our school librarians hosted a roundtable for students during lunch. It was virtual because we were still all virtual at the time. And all the students were invited, anyone could come. It was a safe place. It was a really wonderful experience for our students who attended, and they were able to talk about their feelings and talk about what they had heard and things they had seen in the media. And we had parent pushback on it. And I think that that is a challenge because things are so polarized now that it's hard for people to look out of their lens to see the bigger picture and where this conversation could have taken students to form their own decisions and, to build those opinions and the things that they should be building as they move through school.
Yeah, I can add to that. I'll share a story with you. During one of the State of the Union addresses, an AP government teacher watched the State of the Union with her kids and then proceeded to watch the Democratic rebuttal. So this was from 2016 to 2020. And there was a parent that wanted to know why they were showing only the Democratic side of the rebuttal. And she had to explain that the president is a Republican and there only is the Democratic rebuttal. So we're trying to combat, oftentimes, we're trying to combat a lack of information with information. And we're also trying to combat irrational thought with rational thought. And it's very difficult to do. If somebody is in a heightened emotional state, if somebody is fervently believing what we could easily call a lie, or we'll just call maybe an irrational belief, it becomes very difficult to bring that person around. And hitting them with a barrage of facts is probably not the way to do it. There's a certain amount of interpersonal things that need to happen. We need to kind of de-escalate the situation before we can actually begin to encounter anything that resembles the truth. So, you know, I think there are significant challenges in our society. We are awash in content. We probably spend more time trying to figure out what to watch on Netflix instead of actually watching something on Netflix. We spend more time trying to sift through information, trying to figure out, you know, what news sources can be trusted. And then, you know, having this, we spend more time trying to find what the quote unquote truth is than we do actually reading in-depth coverage of it. It's different than it was 30 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, where you had to go to a library to find information. That does not happen anymore. You can find it on your phone. The problem is the information you're finding, and this is inevitable, most likely has some type of nefarious agenda attached to it. And that information you're finding in your Google search has been tailored for you. It is re-emphasized by the metadata that you have put out there. So it's very tricky, and media literacy goes beyond how to investigate sources, but I think it also, there needs to be an awareness of how our own kind of bubbles of information, and how Netflix says, you might like this. Google does the same thing. YouTube does the same thing. And we need to find out ways of consciously stepping out of those thought bubbles that we surround ourselves with, whether consciously or unconsciously, to make sure that we are hearing other perspectives. Living in Western Maryland, which is a fairly red area, that is abundantly clear to me on a daily basis.
If I could just add, I feel that at Wide Angle, our challenge is getting students into this conversation as soon as possible. And so it's just as a teaching artist, it's just so encouraging to hear that, Jennifer, you're bringing kindergartners into this. Their first words need to be media literacy, honestly, because it's so important to. These are just the basic tools. And I feel that Annika brought this up, that it goes beyond media literacy. There's contextualization. There's so many other things that go into it that we need to start having these conversations as early as possible, so that by the time they get to middle school and high school, they're going into Wide Angle and are already informed and are wanting to make stories about this to inform their peers who aren't necessarily as informed as they are. And the best way to approach a group, to approach this young generation, is to have them advocate for themselves and put them into positions to start creating media to go against that narrative in their own communities.
So lots of challenges raised, although I definitely see some themes, right, in the both the like encouraging folks to take on teaching this when we know they already have tons to do, right, and like supporting the collaborations that would help teachers do that work. The increasing political polarization from both, I think, families and students themselves and teachers, and how we navigate that. And then I think just the preponderance of race and racist messages that students might encounter online, and how, I think Annika touched on this, we can like actively work against that by taking this anti-racist lens. So that's a lot of challenges, and that's not even all of them. So I want to transition to talking about, you know, what we can do proactively, both in and out of schools, to better support teachers and community organizations and students. So I think starting again with Scott and Jennifer, I'm curious, and actually Annika and Destiny, since you guys have recently had experience in schools, what kinds of supports do teachers need to take on teaching media literacy? And how can schools, including librarians, provide that support?
I think there needs to be a lot of training. Simply throwing, and I know I've thrown some links out there, but simply throwing out a bunch of links for people to use is not necessarily where it ends. That's really where it begins. Teachers, I think, need training on how to teach controversial issues. I think that they need to be coached on how to do that. They themselves, teachers themselves, also need to look inside themselves and question their own beliefs, and question, what is my agenda, because I know I have one, and how can I dissuade and separate that from what I'm trying to do in class. So that's a lot of work. But unfortunately, if that's not done, a seemingly innocuous resource in the hands of an untrained teacher can have disastrous consequences for that teacher and those kids. And I've seen that happen. And I've also seen people use really tricky subject matter, like talking about the storming of the Capitol the day after, and dealing with it in a magnificent way. So it really, the ability of teachers to foster good conversations and foster good research using appropriate tools. But I don't think that we have a built-in mechanism for that training just yet. There are courses out there. I took a civic online reasoning course. It was awesome. It was through some school in New England that I totally forget right now.
MIT, probably.
Yeah, probably. But so it shows you what I get for not writing it down. The point is that there's a tremendous amount of work that teachers need to do to equip themselves to deal with not only how to teach truth seeking, but also how to deal with the emotional responses that they're going to get from themselves and also their kids and also their parents.
I think another support that we definitely need to have in place is that you first need to start with yourself, and you need to look inside and really kind of find your own biases and your own implicit biases, and you need to recognize them, check them, and then understand how you can move forward to have these hard conversations. We've done a lot of work with the social justice standards and looking at we've used a lot of Library of Congress materials and looking at things through different lenses and different ways that things can be perceived as part of our media literacy training that we've done with school librarians. And not everyone is comfortable having the hard conversations. And thankfully, my district is small enough. There's 22 amazing school librarians that I work with, that we all know each other well and we can have those hard conversations. But I feel like the supports need to be put in place because not everyone has that, and not everyone has that safe place where they can have the uncomfortable conversations in order to move forward with teaching and understanding and having the conversations that need to happen around media literacy and racism and diversity and equity. So I don't know where you find the time to do that in the way that things are packed so tightly. But it's definitely something that we should be finding the time for, to have those conversations.
I fully agree with both those things that both of you said. And I kind of wanted to add a little bit about that training element. I think while it often feels kind of tangential from media literacy, I think a really big element of training must be how to talk about identity in an inclusive and cognizant way. And I think along with that comes the ability for a teacher to recognize when an article or a video or something like that may contain some kind of offensive terminology in it. Because language is always evolving, it's always changing. Students in different classrooms have different preferences for terms around, like, for example, sexuality and gender, queerness versus LGBTQ or LGBTQIA+, and things like that. And I think it's really important that teachers be equipped with the tools to use the language that is most appropriate for and respectful of their individual students. And I think a second thing here, kind of to what someone was saying in the chat before, is that it's not just something that can be relegated to English or social science classes. It has to be in every single course study. I mean, I think media literacy has a really big element in biology classes, for example, where you think about how female scientists are often cut out of different narratives about discoveries and major inventions. And that too is a form of, okay, like, is this article really giving me the entire picture, or is it perpetuating sexist and racist tropes around discoveries and scientific innovation? And I think it really has to be universal and very intentional across the board.
Yes, I would just say that I was not exposed to media literacy until I was given the task to teach it. And I found that so interesting. And I've spoken with my students, and it's not common practice to learn these things. And as Annika mentioned, it's so applicable to so many fields and so many different topics. And so it just begs the question, why? And so I think that goes into what Jennifer had mentioned about there needing to be some type of, and Scott as well, about some type of training enforced that equips us to teach these things, because I now know as a student and as a teacher, it can be tricky to know how to go about it. And also there being an emotional aspect, understanding those biases and things that you have personally, it's personal, and understanding how to have those conversations with students in a way that everyone feels good afterwards and feels encouraged to return back to the conversation. And it's not something that I was uncomfortable with, and so I'm going to table it, and that's something that I leave to the side. Getting comfortable about having those uncomfortable conversations. Yeah.
Thank you all for that. And I think, every teacher should be a civics teacher, right? And I think media literacy is one area where we can help teachers. And again, I study media literacy, so I'm biased, but where we can help every teacher, right? Biology teachers, Annika gave a great example of, English teachers, social studies teachers, math teachers, right? Think about all the data literacy that we need to analyze and evaluate media sources these days. That all of these teachers have a role to play in teaching media literacy, and that can be like an in, I think, in some ways, to being a civic educator and connecting to civic education. But school isn't the only place this happens. So I want to, my last kind of question before we turn to audience questions, so please keep entering those in the chat, is how both extracurricular activities and community organizations like Wide Angle can continue to support young people to develop media literacy, and what we can do to ensure that those opportunities are equitably distributed, right? Like all students have access to them.
Well, I can start by saying that my current initiative surrounding media literacy is to have the message of media literacy become their own, become something that students take ownership on. And I'm actually guiding a team of 5 students to create a proposal for the National Association of Media Literacy Conference. Wide Angle's never had a team of 5 students teach a presentation. When I was approached with the opportunity, I was invited to do a proposal as a teacher. And I thought, I'm like, these students should be doing this. Not only is it important for educators to see the faces that are being influenced by media literacy, but also it's empowering for the students to develop a proposal, to create a presentation. That's the next step that takes something from learning it in the classroom to really putting it into practice and really being able to take ownership and say, this is something that I now know and I can now teach others. So that's what we're working as an organization currently with.
I think the question of like equitably accessing these programs is one that is always really hard for like me to think about and to even begin to answer, because there are so many access barriers that impede getting involved with, extracurriculars overall, let alone media literacy related extracurricular activities, because, marketing is often relegated to upper class neighborhoods, or everything is monolingual and just English and stuff like that. But I think a really big way to make these more accessible is to partner with schools to do so and get marketing material in school buildings, really be intentionally advertising to lower income neighborhood schools, really be going into every single classroom, not just the honors or the AP English class where you might have a kid who's more inclined for writing than, someone in the on-level course, because there are so many things that influence whether someone is in honors or AP to begin with, And I think schools really are probably the most, well, I mean, not individual schools, but like school systems, I would say, are probably the most diverse and all-encompassing bodies we have to work with for outreach purposes compared to individual like third-party marketing approaches. And I think that is a really important thing to intentionally harness and, be diverse and intentional within that community too, not just going to these upper level or, like white centric classrooms and other clubs.
Scott or Jennifer, anything you want to add on that?
I would just real quick would add, we've done a few things with our public library, partnering with them as a community organization, and hosted some different events around information literacy, digital literacy, media literacy, some geared toward teens and tweens. With various degrees of success, we've invited the State Library Resource Center down to do a few community nights, and there's some interest, but we don't seem to get like the numbers that we feel like we should get. So either we're not advertising it right or we're missing the mark, but it's there are small things happening. It definitely needs to be more, but what has happened I have found very interesting, and it's been interesting to see the mix of people who show up to the events. And of course, this past year we haven't had anything, but hopefully eventually we'll be able to start back up again.
I just tend to fall back on figuring out ways to hook people's interest and getting them to understand that truth is not handed to them, it's pursued. It is a lifelong quest, and unfortunately I don't really have any standards that I can cite or anything like that, but I really try to foster an innate curiosity in any kid that I taught, and an innate curiosity in any adult that I work with, both at a professional level and personal level. And I try to be inclusive of everybody. And that's tricky because there's language around inclusivity, but I think at times there's people that we're missing. And I think we have to be aware of that, because we have to invite everybody. And that's difficult because I have to invite people to the conversation that I vehemently disagree with. But as long as they're willing to express their opinion with dignity and based on research, I have to be willing to entertain them. I'm going to drop something in the chat, just a quote that sums up a lot better than anything I articulated.
So we're going to turn now to some questions from the audience, and I apologize in advance if we don't get to all of them, because there has been a lot in the chat that I look forward to actually like carefully reading and digesting. But one of the questions that's come up a couple times is how we connect, thinking about media literacy as part of a larger project of civic education and civic engagement. How do we connect media literacy efforts to supporting students to actually like take informed action? So like connecting the evaluation and production to action, and what does that look like?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's actually a very organic relationship between media literacy and civic engagement, because I think the more time you spend unpacking a big weighty subject, whether it's the ongoing farmers' protests in India or Black Lives Matter protests here or academic inequity or what have you, I think the more impassioned you get to really wanting to counter these big scale systemic issues in our lives, in our world. And I think kind of more specific examples here end up being, as a student paper, we do political endorsements for the Board of Education. And I think that directly translates to more students wanting to be involved with things like phone banking and electioneering and volunteerism for these candidates. I think you do things like cover a climate crisis protest, and that kind of empowers a kid who was covering that subject to then want to go and be involved in that movement in their own regard too. And I feel like there's just a very natural care and compassion you develop for the world around you as you begin to dissect these issues from like a very critical media literacy point of view.
Yeah, adding on to that, wide angle gives students the tools so that they can take them afterwards. You know, we recently had a 20th anniversary celebration, and you come to see, you know, people who are now having their children attend wide angle after they've graduated 15 and 16 years ago. They really understand how the tools that they've learned have just carried out along their career in so many different various ways. And so one important transition that wide angle has taken in the pandemic is ensuring that all the elements of our classes are accessible to all of our students outside of the program. So before, we would have open lab where we would have our Adobe Premiere Pro and all these great fancy things, but we've transitioned to using Canva and WeVideo and free alternatives that still get at the same idea, so that students feel empowered to use these skills to start going into their community. So maybe right now we're focusing on the Black Lives Matter movement, but if in the future there's something else that you feel can still use those same skills, they'll now have those tools in their toolkit to use them. So it's about getting them into the practice of being able to advocate for themselves. It starts with that one time that they're listened to, when usually they're the person in class that keeps their mouth shut or doesn't stand up when they know something's wrong. That one time when they feel listened to and validated becomes the next 100 times, or fuels the next 100 times. And I say that because I know it for myself, that I'm an advocate for my peers. And Annika's shaking her head because she probably feels the same way, that the more you feel empowered to lead, the more you empower others. So
as an educator, I have to walk a fine line between being accused of sending students into battle, so to speak, in terms of telling them what actions to take as part of their informed civic action. But there's two things that I would say, and one is always speak truth to power. Don't be afraid to question in any conversation. And the second thing I would say is actually a quote from Shakespeare in Henry IV. Tell truth and shame the devil. Continue to interrogate reality, find truth, share truth respectfully, and be relentless in your pursuit. And that, in essence, is a way of taking action, is refusing to allow yourself to be deceived and refusing to allow somebody's opinion be expressed and believed just because they're in a position of power. But again, those are things that, as an educator, I can encourage kids to speak their mind, but I have to be very careful about what direction I'm steering them in.
So another question that came up, and I'm sort of grouping some questions together into themes, is thinking again back to the issue of political polarization and how polarized the media has become, how contentious even conversations about media have become, and how we can support teachers in and out of school to navigate those issues. Like, how do you deal with some of you already shared, like families that are upset about conversations students are having about media in the spaces you occupy, and what advice you have for people thinking about those issues?
I can hop in. My best advice is to stay calm. Like, if you find yourself getting, like they can tell that you're getting visibly upset, it doesn't help anyone. And to really stop and listen, because there's a reason why they're saying what they're saying, and try to find where it's coming from. there's an example that I'll share that I saw. Somebody who I really love had posted on Facebook, and it was just the craziest thing I'd ever seen in my entire life, with absolutely like no truth to it whatsoever. It was insane. And the knee-jerk reaction was like to comment back, but I had to stop myself and take a step back and have the conversation in person. Why did you post that, and like listen to it? And then I came at it from a media literacy angle, and because I didn't want to attack their personal beliefs, but hey, did you know that you could go to All Sides now and you could look and you could see, and so kind of approaching it that way is just probably my best advice, is stay calm and be analytical about it. Don't let your I know we're all very passionate about it. I know I am, and I want everyone toeing the line and like doing all these things, but the calmer you can stay, I find the more success you have.
I would agree with that. Being calm is very important. Giving resources for people to look at is also good, instead of telling them, just letting them explore fact-checking websites, All Sides, and all those types of things, pointing out inconsistencies, and reminding folks of how much we don't know. Oftentimes it's like, well, this is what I think because my friend told me, or I watched a YouTube video on it, or I saw it on Facebook. I try to stay away from social media sites because I found that they harshed my calm, as it were. So I tend to avoid those types of things, and instead I talk to people in live conversations, and I feel that that's probably a better approach for me.
I really like what Scott said about how we all don't know things. I think that it's really important to acknowledge that, and to cancel culture. Wide Angle is a nonpartisan organization. We are youth-led, youth-centered, and youth-oriented. And so in that way, we provide a space for everyone to have these conversations. And I think it's so important to, regardless of what my personal values are, to provide that space for people to change their minds. That if they don't feel comfortable to speak and to have that conversation, then people shut down and we back up. And it was a really nerve-wracking moment for one of the students in my class when we were talking about the Oscars So White narrative, because it aligned with one of the events we were creating. And she talked about how her parents were still Trump supporters, and how she's scared to say that because she feels like people will hate her for that. And her being able to share that at Wide Angle really spoke to the level of comfortability that she felt there, to be able to have those conversations and seek out new information. And she had questions, and students were there to answer. And so just taking that minute to understand that we all are products of how we grew up, of our background. There's so much that goes into a person and into a person's beliefs and ideals. So it's to move away from that idea of you're a wrong person, to just get into that conversation.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. And I think something that I think about often is it's so much better, I think, for someone to learn and grow in a positive and conducive space to that internal reflection and growth than it is for someone to take that harmful rhetoric out into public space or other public spaces where it could really like hurt or offend or further traumatize someone because of using really not okay terminology or language. And I think it is just better if we can counter that in a safe and growth-centric environment. At the same time, I know that for me as a student who works with other students, it can be really, really hard to navigate the interpersonal dynamic of that relationship. And I think for me, like the easiest thing to do is to, like, when I'm editing a story, go down the Google document and just comment source for everything that makes no sense. Just comment the word source. And more often than not, there is no source to back up that offensive claim because untrue and unfounded. And I think it's a much easier route to take to ask someone to find a source and find their own route to, oh, yeah, this was wrong. I was incorrect. Thank you for catching that. As opposed to like, no, how dare you call me out for like being racist? I'm not racist, you know, because it's probably just from a place of misinformation, not intentional harm or anything like that.
Thank you all. Really like lots of fodder for thought there. And we're gonna move to breakout rooms in just a few minutes, but I wanna, before we do that, give all the panelists just another chance to, if there's other things that are on your mind, if there's things you really wanna share or wish you had a chance to share, I wanna just leave the floor open for sort of one last thought or a few last thoughts from each of you.
There was one question in the chat that really like caught my eye about whether we count things like Twitter and social media platforms as like media. And okay, like I'm a high school senior. I live on Twitter these days. So I personally I do count Twitter as a source of media because I think people get information off of it. Articles are posted there. A lot of expert sources will like run these informative threads about conflicts or certain subjects because people like me right now literally only have a 280 character attention span. And I think it is media that has to be fact checked appropriately too, because I think you can't propagate a thing because, oh, like so-and-so tweeted it. You have to fact check and corroborate that with another source somehow. But I think Twitter is media that we have to consume in the same critical lens we consume everything else.
I guess if I were gonna, my parting shot, as it were, would be to collaborate with your school librarian, because they really are amazing sources of knowledge, and they want to do the media literacy, the engagement, the information literacy with classroom teachers, and also to approach things not only with the media literacy lens, but with a social justice lens in mind as well. Because when you look at the media literacy standards and the social justice standards and the American Association of School Librarians standards and the C3 social studies standards, they all come together in a very nice way. And so the more collaboration we can do, the more we can get it out there, and the more we can make sure that everyone is prepared for the onslaught that we all face with media every day.
Continue to seek answers. There is, I honestly believe, at least in the world of politics and objective reality, I think we should dwell in what Bertrand Russell referred to as the furniture of the world as much as possible, and continue to pursue truth and pursue knowledge, and but also at the same point in time, remember that Socratic maxim that you need to admit how much you don't know every day, and exercise great humility at all times in your life. Yeah.
I would just say thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was great to not only engage in conversation with the panelists, but to see questions and comments in the chat. It just really makes me smile to see that there's so many other fighters in this fight. I mean, it's a really big mountain to climb, and there's so much to be done in so many aspects of our society. But when we have conversations like this, even when it's in a virtual Zoom room, it just feels so much more, it feels more personal, and it feels more connected. And as Jennifer was saying about that collaboration, that's really the solution to anything, is getting more people involved and getting more hands in the pot. And so I just wanted to say thank you for everyone attending tonight and just being so engaged and caring.
Yeah, I want to absolutely echo that. Thanks. And that's a wonderful note to end this section of the conversation on destiny, because in a second we're going to shift to breakout rooms, so all of you have more of a chance to continue talking about and wrestling with these issues and questions. So we have, as you can see on your screen, a few discussion questions. These are suggestions. Please talk about like whatever comes to mind, and these are in the notes Google Doc as well. But really just sharing and continuing the conversations that these wonderful panelists have already started. Please do, as a reminder, pick a note taker and use the form that's already linked in the chat. And then remember that all ideas are welcome. We're seeking to understand, as we've discussed in this roundtable already. Please be aware of how much space and time, airtime you're taking up. Speak from your own experience, invite others to share, and use those fun and beautiful interaction cards. And with that, I just want to say again, a real heartfelt thanks to these 4 wonderful panelists who took some time out of their evening to share their experience and expertise with us. It's been a great learning experience for me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all.